Monastery Writing number 1. So here I find myself at the Monastery of Christ in the desert, with approximately 2 days of solitude, silence, or so I thought, exhausted from being me, resentful at blood family for being them, and trying to find myself in all of those identities and expectations. What do? Pick up an armful of Thomas Merton and head for my little covey, private hermitage in row of Hermitage Hotel. Beautiful, clean, esoteric, and somewhat very much in the line of male-dominated ideologies of what direct communion with God entails. So, what does Merton have to say, you ask? Well, I don't really know, of course, but here's a stab at a few ideas I came across. In Union and Division, Chapter 7 of the New Seeds of Contemplation, Merton says really cool things, not necessarily new by any stretch of the imagination. But his wording and workings can be powerful. He begins with how we are born into selfishness, and from that steps into how, in our efforts to be more real, we become less real, because it revolves around a lie. Now I'm going to make a jump here over the possible religious idea of being born into selfishness, and move it as I reflect into being born with an ego. For me, the ego is not selfish, in a negative sense. Rather, it is the part of us that protects the physical body, including the mental, from others. As I look at birth and death, that part of ego is at the whim of the community of other beings that it finds itself. The discussion of how it lands in that place is an entirely different discussion that is very interesting, but here I want to stay with this idea of pursuing the self as an individual, as being the building upon a lie. I agree and I disagree. Merton is coming from the idea that it is an all or none proposition in some ways, or at least his example does, where a person who knows nothing of God tries to, quote, become real by imposing themselves on other people, by appropriating for themselves some share of the limited supply of created goods, and thus emphasizing the difference between themselves and the other men who have less than they, or nothing at all, end quote. Well, that certainly does not seem good to probably any of us reading this, and if and when such men exist, I assume they do not really care about the ideas of union. So that means it is really us who have already found that path lacking, that even see this division, and ask why it leads to such loss of self. He goes on to say that these people can only conceive of becoming real by, quote, cutting themselves off from other people and building a barrier of contrast and distinction between themselves and other men, end quote. And that they do not know that reality is to be, quote, sought not in division but in unity, for we are members of one another, end quote. Okay, so what is the big deal here? Why preach to the choir? Here I have a question to his use and meaning of the word reality, but I do agree with where he ultimately goes with this, and try not to tangle with the fact that Merton is a religious person who sees union with God from the practice of faith through an established church. I am saying this because Merton states that the individual will find in death that he does not exist, did not exist for a long time, and is lost and will not find God, because God will say, I know you not. Really? That seems harsh. I'm okay with the individual being alone at death because that is the path that they have chosen, but my idea of God never says to anyone, I know you not. This is the hard language of religion that I find divisive, even when wielded by Merton. However, what I find myself agreeing with here is that if we choose to live this life driven by our ego, or even completely driven by our ego, death is certainly nothing to look forward to, because it is the end. The temple and trappings of the body and the individual are lost with death, and even if those remaining look to your individual contribution during your lifetime, no matter what they are, you as ego are truly gone. When the ego becomes the part of you that helps you to care for your beautiful beast of burden, your physical body and identity, but does not rule your decision-making, only sits at the table to assist in these decisions with higher ideas of love, compassion, and community, then one can celebrate and build upon the individual spaceship you were born to, that is unique in so many ways, not just physically, but in time and place. Why would God create the individual as unique if there was not something to be learned from that place of isolation? What Merton ends with in the chapter grabs me back to his point, which is summed up nicely here. Quote, I must look for my identity, somehow not only in God but in other men." End quote. Here is where parts of my higher self sit at the table with ego in my decision-making. I will never be able to find myself if I isolate myself from the rest of mankind, as if I were a different kind of being. Ultimately, the book in other chapters builds on the idea that solitude is essential for all humans in the building upon the higher self, the face of God within us all. But solitude is not to be rid of other humans and the clamors of the world and the loss of self amongst the masses. Rather, it is so that one can reestablish with God, balance the self, and come back to love and enjoy his or her community of all other humans. This is beautiful, and Merton teaches me here about solitude, which I probably truly only saw as revitalization and alignment, forgetting that ultimately my heaven is walking amongst us, being able to see beauty in all of us, to see that over our plights and fearful egos, over what limits we may have been born to in time and space that greatly shaped our spaceships, we are all here walking together at this moment. There are no accidents, as one of my mentors so beautifully puts it, and everything is here for your perfect liberation.